The scorching midday sun blazed mercilessly over the savannah, turning the landscape into a shimmering sea of gold and amber. An ATV roared across the parched terrain, its wheels churning up thick clouds of red dust that hung in the still air like smoke. Behind the wheel, Scott gripped tight, his knuckles white against the worn leather. Sweat poured down his weathered face, stinging his eyes, soaking through his khaki uniform. At 67 years old, Scott was no stranger to this land. 40 years he had patrolled these plains as a senior ranger. 40 years of watching over the wild things that called this place home. He knew every watering hole, every migration route, every hidden danger. He was a veteran in every sense of the word. Yet even now, even after all these years, rescue calls made his heart pound like a drum in his chest. The radio on his dashboard crackled with static, then a voice cut through. Northern water source, Thompson's Gazelle, caught in wire fence, distressed. Scott's jaw tightened. He pressed harder on the accelerator, the engine roaring in response. This was a race against time. In this heat, an animal trapped without water wouldn't last long. The vultures were probably already circling. Then it happened. Without warning, a massive pit yawned open in the earth directly ahead. Scott's eyes widened. He slammed his foot on the brake pedal, felt the wheels lock and skid. But it was too late. The laws of physics were unforgiving. The ATV's front wheels sliced through empty air, finding nothing but space where solid ground should have been. The vehicle pitched forward violently, and Scott felt his stomach drop as gravity took hold. The crash came with a sickening crunch of metal and a dull, thunderous thud. The ATV flipped onto its side, throwing Scott from his seat like a rag doll. His body hit the ground hard, limbs flailing. Then his head struck something solid, a jagged rock jutting from the earth. Pain exploded through his skull for one blinding instant. Then nothing. The world went dark. Consciousness fled. Scott lay motionless. Under the burning sun, on the blood-red earth of Africa, an old man lay collapsed and broken. Time became meaningless. Minutes or hours, it was impossible to say. The heat pressed down like a physical weight. Flies began to gather. Then came the laughter. Not human laughter, but something far more sinister. A chilling, cackling sound that echoed across the empty savannah. Hyenas. 1, 2, 3. Then more emerged from the wavering heat. 4, 5, 6 of them, slinking forward with their characteristic hunched gait. They sniffed the air eagerly, noses twitching, the scent of blood, the smell of an easy meal, the promise of death. Their eyes glittered with ancient hunger as they approached, tongues lolling, yellow teeth bared in anticipation. The sound of their footsteps grew closer, paws patting softly on the hard-packed earth. They began to circle, calculating, waiting for the right moment to move in for the kill. Right then, everything changed. A low, rumbling growl rolled across the savannah like distant thunder. It was a sound that spoke of power, of dominance, of majesty. The hyenas froze, ears flattening against their skulls. Their heads swiveled as one toward the source of that sound. 5 massive silhouettes emerged from the shimmering distance, moving with slow, deliberate grace. As they drew closer, their features became clear, and they were extraordinary. White fur, pure as snow, glowing almost ethereal in the harsh sunlight. Albino lions, rare, magnificent, deadly. They approached with the confident stride of apex predators, muscles rippling beneath their pale coats. The largest, a massive male with a flowing white mane, led the way. His amber eyes were fixed on the hyenas with unmistakable intent. The hyenas, for all their numbers and cunning, were nothing but cowards in the face of such raw power. They backed away, whimpering, their earlier bravado evaporating like morning dew. The lions didn't even need to charge. Their mere presence was enough. The hyenas scattered, tails between their legs, disappearing into the tall grass. The lions continued forward until they reached Scott's motionless body. They paused, nostrils flaring as they sniffed the air around him. The largest male stepped closer and lowered his massive head. He nudged Scott's shoulder gently with his nose, testing for a response. Nothing. No movement. No sound. The lion lifted his head and slowly circled around the fallen ranger, examining him from every angle. Then, with a quiet dignity, he sat down beside Scott's body. One by one, the other four lions followed suit, positioning themselves in a protective circle around the unconscious man. To any observer, it would have looked like predators claiming their prey, waiting patiently for the right moment to feed. But something was different. The lions didn't attack. There was no biting, no clawing, no feeding frenzy. They simply sat there, still as statues, patient as stone, waiting, guarding, protecting. But why? Why would wild lions protect a human? The answer lay in the past, 10 years ago to be exact. That summer, a brutal drought had consumed the savannah with merciless fury. It was the kind of drought that killed indiscriminately, the kind that left the earth cracked and bleeding. Grass withered and crumbled to dust. Waterholes dried up completely, leaving only cracked mud and the bones of animals who had died waiting for rain that never came. One by one, the creatures of the savannah collapsed under the unrelenting heat. Scott had been on patrol that day, as he was every day, driving slowly through his territory, checking on the struggling wildlife. That's when he saw movement on the parched earth ahead. As he drew closer, his weathered heart sank in his chest. 5 albino lion cubs, white-furred little ones, so rare they seemed almost mythical. They were crying out weakly, their small voices barely audible. Their pristine fur was covered in red dust. Their eyes were half closed, barely conscious. If Scott had been even an hour later, they would have died. There was no doubt about that. Then he saw why they were alone. Beside the cubs lay their mother, a beautiful albino lioness. Her body was already cold and stiff. She had died of dehydration and starvation, fighting to the very end to keep her babies alive. The cubs refused to leave their dead mother's side, still nuzzling against her, still searching instinctively for milk that would never come. Scott pulled out his radio with shaking hands and reported the situation to headquarters. He waited for their response, hoping for authorization to help. But when the reply came, it was cold and bureaucratic. Resources are limited. We can't waste them on every animal in distress. It's nature. Just leave them. Scott stared at the radio in his hand for a long moment. Then he turned it off. He looked down at the cubs and they looked back at him. Little eyes clouded with approaching death gazed up at him, eyes pleading for life, eyes filled with such desperate will to survive that it broke something open in his chest. He made a decision, not as a ranger who had done this work for 40 years, bound by regulations and protocols, but as a human being with a conscience and a heart. He loaded the cubs into his vehicle one by one, their small bodies so light and fragile in his arms. He brought them to his home on the edge of the reserve. He built a temporary shelter in his backyard, working through the night. Every 3 hours, he fed them milk from a bottle. He gave them fluids to prevent dehydration. He disinfected their wounds where thorns had scratched them. He applied medicine with gentle hands. His colleagues said he was crazy. His supervisor warned him repeatedly about violating regulations, about the consequences he might face. But Scott didn't stop. He couldn't. A year passed. The cubs grew stronger, healthier, larger. Their white coats gleamed. Their eyes were bright and alert. They played and fought and learned, the way young lions should. But Scott knew the truth. It was time. Time for them to return to where they belonged. He took them deep into the savannah, far from human settlements, and opened the vehicle doors. At first, the young lions hesitated. They had known only Scott's care for their entire remembered lives. They circled around him, confused, reluctant to leave. But their wild instincts, dormant but never dead, called to them like an ancient song. One by one, they walked away into the tall grass. Before leaving, the largest male cub, the one who had always been the boldest, approached Scott one final time. He sniffed Scott's hand with his nose, memorizing the scent. Then slowly he turned and followed his siblings into the wilderness. Scott stood there for a long time, watching the small white silhouettes disappear into the landscape. Part of his chest felt empty, hollowed out. Yet at the same time, it was filled with something warm and profound. He had done the right thing. From that day forward, Scott often thought about those cubs. Were they living well? Were they surviving, growing, thriving? In his worn wallet, he kept a single photograph. Himself, much younger, smiling broadly, with 5 tiny white lion cubs tumbling around his feet. And now, 10 years later, those small lives Scott had saved were fully grown adults, and they were protecting their savior. Just as Scott hadn't abandoned them when they were dying a decade ago, now it was their turn. They hadn't forgotten. 10 years had passed, but they remembered everything. The warm hands that lifted them from certain death, the milk fed to them every night, the gentleness that healed their wounds, the voice that soothed them when they cried. The lions continued their vigil. When more hyenas approached, drawn by the scent, the white lions rose as one and chased them away with fierce growls and snapping jaws. When vultures descended from the sky, wings spread wide, the lions threatened them until they retreated. They protected Scott with all their might, refusing to let anything harm him. They refused to give up on this life, just as he had refused to give up on theirs. Hours passed under the merciless sun. The lions moved closer, pressing their bodies against Scott's, shading him from the worst of the heat with their own bulk. They kept him cool. They kept him safe. When Scott failed to check in, headquarters grew concerned. They tracked his ATV's GPS signal and dispatched a search team. 2 jeeps arrived at the scene, engines roaring, kicking up clouds of dust. The rangers who stepped out froze in shock. The overturned ATV, Scott collapsed on the ground. And 5 enormous white lions surrounding him like sentries. One ranger pulled out his rifle with trembling hands. "Scott's in danger," he whispered. "We have to rescue him, now." The lions spotted the newcomers immediately. They rose in unison and began to growl, low and threatening. Their eyes were watchful, their posture protective. They positioned themselves between Scott and the approaching humans. "Get down, everyone get down!" the lead ranger shouted, raising his weapon. "We have a situation here." But the lions didn't retreat. Instead, they bared their teeth even more aggressively, warning the humans to stay back. Tension crackled in the air. Fingers moved slowly toward triggers. Rifle sights aligned on the largest male lion's head. At that exact moment, Scott's finger twitched. His eyelids fluttered. Consciousness, after so many hours, began to return. Through blurred vision, he saw his colleagues. He saw the guns. He saw the lions. He saw what was about to happen. With every ounce of strength he possessed, Scott forced his broken body upright. Pain screamed through every nerve. His arms trembled. His legs wobbled. Blood pounded in his head. But he couldn't stop. He had to move. He staggered to his feet and stumbled forward, placing himself between the guns and the lions. "Don't shoot!" His voice was hoarse, barely audible. "Please, they protected me. They saved me." Now it was Scott's turn to protect them. The colleagues hesitated, confused. The gun barrels slowly lowered. Their faces showed complete disbelief. The largest male lion, the one Scott had bottle-fed so many years ago, slowly approached. He sniffed Scott's outstretched hand. That familiar scent, the scent from a decade ago, the hands that fed him milk, the warmth that healed his wounds. Scott's hand trembled as he stroked the massive lion's head. "You remembered," he whispered, tears streaming down his dusty face. "Thank you. Thank you so much." The other lions approached one by one. They surrounded Scott, sniffing his hands, rubbing against him gently, sharing memories from 10 years ago. This wasn't a farewell. This was a reunion. The colleagues carefully approached and supported Scott under his arms. They guided him toward the waiting vehicle. Scott walked a few steps, then stopped. He turned around. The lions sat quietly, watching him leave. As the vehicle started moving, the lions rose in unison. Together, they lifted their heads and howled, a long, haunting cry that echoed across the entire savannah, carrying for miles. It was a song of farewell, a song of gratitude, a song of friendship that transcended species. Inside the vehicle, Scott closed his eyes. Tears continued to fall. Later in a hospital bed, Scott reached for his worn wallet on the side table. He pulled out that old photograph, himself so much younger, smiling with 5 tiny white lion cubs. Those tiny lives had saved him today. 10 years had passed, but they hadn't forgotten. Scott thought slowly, painfully. What if, 10 years ago, he had turned away from those dying cubs? What if he had followed orders and left them to nature? He would have died today. He would have become food for the hyenas. He would have died alone under the burning sun. Through the window, the savannah sunset painted the sky in shades of crimson and gold. Under that magnificent sky, in the distance, 5 white silhouettes seemed to move across the horizon. Kindness is never forgotten. Love is never wasted. And sometimes when we save a life, we save our own. If this story touched your heart, please support us with a like and subscribe. We'll return with more moving stories next time.